Good morning. Thank you for your introduction.
Obrigado aos colegas pela generosa contribuição que não somente me estimula, mas
not only do you make me think, because talking about the pandemic and the past pandemics, I remember the past pandemic. I was the peste bubonica, and it's not an equal condition of normality. And thinking about normality, the social sciences were taught in a context in which there wouldn't be spaces for both things, global pandemics, and they were opposed in social sciences. And I think that we have the main paradigmatic readings that are associated with war and pandemics. And we hope we are going to have an increase so that we can learn something in thinking about a better post-pandemic world. And there is a concentration of optimism where there's more vaccination and vice versa. I've been following research by Bayreuth University in Germany, and the trust in the future, a trust that we can increase, so we improve society, has to do with the vulgarities that our president offers us every day or on a daily basis. So, but of course, it makes me think about both about this resource in history and how it repeats itself, and the Marxist versions of right now the notion of a culture that is epistemic, and I feel there is a continuity of at the moment. And when I see Professor Matheus, this continuity is immediate in terms of its context. In a hospital in Zanzibar, I was reading recently the life in Zanzibar, in which the issue has to do with distancing, but selling objects and looking after impoverished people. It is the space for selling objects for any type of merchandise, so that people could link each other in a context where there couldn't be medical therapy, at least in Zanzibar. So I took some notes.
Se irritar. Mas eu queria, a partir do texto primeiro do professor Luís, dizer que claramente o racismo,
clearly racism, it is interesting in terms of the stereotypes in several generations and the negative characteristics of a people in terms of local senses and global spheres. But there is a micro transformation of racism. We come from the head to the blood that is then abandoned. Lombroso abandons the brain. It's very quickly then for the development of hematology, which is then going to the molecules. It is AADM to genetics and to the virus. So then there is a micro and invisible force that is informed and understood. More illiteracy, on the other hand, the diseases are less visible, and then it's easy and in the past to create this culture of diseases as with searching for these characteristics, associations that people need to be improved, that the ideal people is never ours. It's probably better to people who are symbolic and superior. And here we have the popular principle and synthesizes it's better to have rabo de león de cabeza de ratón. So we prefer to be the last ones, and we should not understand that in the peripheries of the empire, you look at the center of the world for inspiration. The optics, the angle south-south, it's a perspective that we try to stimulate with our colleagues, but it's not natural in terms of looking at afar. So seeking cordiality in our anti-racist propositions, we are more interested in what happens with George Floyd, for example, with all the due respect, with the number, the infinitely larger number of people who killed, but this obsession with whiteness not only is at the center of social knowledge, but also in the centers for the issue that anthropologists state is the social thinking, racial thinking has an origin of sophistication in the same spaces. It's distributed in terms of a racial diffusionism, but this feeling of
O seu microfone está ligado? Bom, gente, tem um microfone ligado, mas não importa. Eu vou gritar mais um pouco. Felipe, não sei o que aconteceu. Perdi o fio da meada. Inclusive, essa sensação de falta se dá...
This notion of lack in the characteristics of people in themselves is more at the margins than that at the center. Gramsci has an interesting sentence that if we, the bourgeoisie in the periphery of the empire, never finds a good balance. So this is worth to all places, colonies that produce the bourgeoisie. An obsession, if you will. And in terms of having an inferiority complex, but then it seems to be important in terms of the contribution to
criado pelas ciências humanas hegemônicas.
How the social and the human sciences, I developed a research in which I talked about the ideas and come to three important countries in Latin America, Cuba, Brazil, and Argentina, and it's then adapted and racialized. It's then withdrawn, and then this colonial forces are also withdrawn, and multicultural perspectives as well.
Para
Then it's taken on in terms of bringing color in Latin America. Then it becomes no longer an issue in order to become a social racial issue. And then research these dialogues in the margins in which the bourgeoisie then have insecurities in terms of whiteness that is denied because they are not convinced that they are being treated as other white people may allow us to understand these dynamics in the Latin American context and how we can think about the coloniality of Latin American life. And then we are talking then about racism and then I see.
Muito mais passo agora a Matheus. Desculpa.
I'm going to share with Matheus. I was thinking about your text. That is a text that has beautiful self-comment, because that's a very interesting text. But what I see here is more continuity than rupture, though for this new point of inflection, in order to conceptualize what is social distancing, because social distancing is an issue that in 1700 with the first experimentation separating the man from animals, that it wasn't easy, because in many contexts cows were worth more than a child. Nobody's going to steal my child, and people will steal my cattle. So the notion is then it's not easy to practice this war, this revolt of vaccination is a classic example, and the attempt of therapeutic intervention that ends up in violence because there's no attempt of a perfect blending that is necessary between white and black. So the notion of social distancing, but with the advance of knowledge, what is understood here in terms of knowledge,
novo curanderismo digital que o
the new forms of self-medication that continue through Google, then the number of associations against charlatanism, because all of the central tenets emerged in terms of combating popular healing forms and homeopathy. So aside from that, self-medication continues through other channels, and there's a number of medications that people then increase, and then there's more control, and there's then a self-medication. How nowadays it's talking about a new digital medicine that sets up, that is understood as experiences of products that have terrible impact. There's a whole culture, of course, fostered by fake news, but then when you are at the verge of death, it makes things easier in terms of finding magic solutions. And in order to conclude, is that there is a conflict between universal interventions that the state first presents as universal and privileges, class privileges, because obviously, as we know, I'm here preaching to the converted because we know we are talking about class privileges and others, but this class privileges transformed in rights brings another typical connotation of the social pyramid in terms of transforming it to rights and events in cases of need in the emergence of the pandemics, because this is an exceptional case. It always creates exceptional cases. Let's think about the pest bubonica, the bubonic pest, in which everybody then was dating everybody, because if everybody is about to die, so if you have a common ill, let's praise happiness. And this possibilities then, in order to justify and explain as anthropologists the rejection that are caused by government in this system, in genocidal government, on popular levels. And I think that the Bolsonaro government appeals to this popular, or it feeds itself, but this popular feeling that absolutely hates Bolsonaro on the other hand. So we need to be more careful in terms of thinking that this behavior during the pandemic has to do with the poor examples of the president. Then I would like us social scientists to make an effort in order to not fall into these easy explanations for complex circumstances, because it's a new pandemic in a new context with a level in a culture that is different from a population that is different in 1904, in São Luís in 1904, Italy in 1904. And obviously, in conclusion, I have sent the link to the tale, the myth of the Escarlate death, which is prosperous in terms of this castle, and the people who want to go in, and they shut down the door, and I think that both in terms of the culture of the fear of death, and there's a continuity. That's it.
Muito obrigada, professor Livio. Muito obrigada.
Professor Livio, thank you. We would like to thank you. And then there is a question on YouTube. It's interesting then to review the need.
A pergunta é: como avaliam essa dicotomia em África e
How do you evaluate this dichotomy between Africa and Brazil, and looking at these differences in terms of the African continent and here in Brazil?
Gustavo, você começa, Gustavo.
Como foi a pergunta geral, acredito que os três podem falar sobre isso.
Tanto faz. Começa aí, Matheus. Eu vou me organizando aqui.
Não, bom, em primeiro lugar, queria agradecer as considerações muito interessantes que o o Livio fez. De fato, quando a gente olha para aquele contexto e olha para agora, a gente tem essa sensação
when we looked at that context,
é muito revoltante. Até agora eu estava revendo esse material para organizar essa coisa de sair, no caso da peste bubônica, né?
the
Um
thing
médico
of living in terms of
estava cuidando de
bubonic
pessoas
pest,
para ir
there was a public who were dealing with people who were then looking after.
Como é que isso acontece? Mas, de fato, é isso que você chamou a atenção também por
So
último.
what you're drawing attention about.
Ela é uma ideia que muda. Então, nesse conto, a opinião do Eusébio tem bastante interessante que não dava para ler tudo aqui, em que a personagem,
in which the character, enslaved character, complains in terms of an assassination,
eles também não são filhos de Deus,
because they aren't they also sons and daughters of
ideia de que olha, é pecado você matar as criaturas que também são divinas, mesmo que do ponto de
who
vista
are also divine, even from the standpoint of rationality, they would be there focused as a problem. And there's another issue that then is in terms of what you're talking about that Livio has placed in terms of Edgar Allan Poe. And at the moment of the pandemic, it is a moment that is initially thought about as a kind of a democracy of the virus, as a moment in which the virus is going to affect everybody. This discourse
da epidemia de coronavírus, que na verdade o vírus, inclusive porque como seus portadores eram inicialmente a gente que pode viajar, que poderia estar
because these were the people, in terms of the standpoint of its entry,
não teria essa a hierarquia.
It wouldn't then have this high social hierarchy that wouldn't be regulated in terms of the distribution of, and we will see then how time then leads us to, in terms of the ways that vaccination is organized and the interrelationship in terms of comorbidities and racialization, we see the racialization of diseases. And this last question is difficult because it's also here at stake in terms of São Luís, how these strategies that were thought about as the state confront or establishes a dialogue with this cosmologies.
É período onde esse diálogo.
It is a time period in which this dialogue actually is a possible dialogue, because many of these and this invasion of homes has to do with what Livio has stated. It is not only a problem, but are the habits and the ways in which people imagine and organize. So this contradiction then, what is strange is exactly
que é quando a gente vive essa pandemia nossa, agora atual, de coronavírus, a gente não consiga estabelecer, quer dizer, uma estratégia melhor, uma estratégia para combinar isso de uma maneira mais efetiva. Eu concordo com o Livio, quer dizer, o setor autoritário que tomou conta do governo federal parece mobilizar muitas vezes censos populares com uma eficácia muito grande, né? Com uma eficácia muito grande. Então isso de fato é bastante problemático na minha percepção. Para começar a conversa, né?
Também vou aqui só reagir um pouco, não sei se eu vou conseguir dar conta. Eu agradeço demais os comentários seu, Livio, e eu acho que, enfim, você desdobra meu texto com coisas que é muito mais amplas e sofisticadas do que eu acho que eu tentei dar conta, mas eu queria pegar um gancho que eu acho que um pouco com o que o Matheus começou, né? Só lembrando agora que um pouco esse início do debate pandêmico, né, com a ideia de que a pandemia ela ia afetar democraticamente, de alguma maneira, porque afetava todos. Aí, quer dizer, não era como, enfim, depois foi ficando cada vez mais nítido isso, mas e não só entre as elites que circulavam, né, internacionalmente, mas só lembrando que, na verdade, o Planalto chegou a ser responsável por quase 10% dos casos de Covid no Brasil, né? Só para lembrar esse fato. Mas, de qualquer maneira, o que eu queria começar a pegar aqui um gancho só pensando um pouco, né, o Livio acho que tocou num ponto que era bem o que eu acho que eu gostaria de chamar a atenção nesse texto que eu montei, de fato, numa noite insone e que saiu. Mas é que eu acho que muito da força que hoje se atribui, que se usa das ideias de contágio, vírus, né, para materializar e dar força ao racismo, talvez venha justamente associado a esse pânico do micro e do invisível, e de como o contágio racial pode estar naquelas dimensões não perceptíveis, né, da vida, né? Ou de como o racismo científico, o atavismo, né, que se chamava na linguagem do racismo científico, que era aquelas propriedades ou qualidades das raças que não eram, que elas ficavam camufladas, né, no corpo humano. E eu acho que talvez justamente venha daí um pouco essa força, né, e que não por acaso a gente ouve com tanta e é uma forma de racialização para muitos sujeitos, digamos assim, né, que nem quando se fala, não é só as classes perigosas no sentido das classes negras, do pós-abolição que se dava, mas tudo isso que a gente ouve, né? A ideia, o vírus do comunismo, quando a gente pensa crime como epidemia, né? Epidemia de crime. Eu acho que tudo são formas que eu acho muito poderosas de naturalizar na vida social fatos eminentemente sociais, né? E sobretudo, eu acho que, como no caso do vírus, ele sempre vem associado a uma linguagem muito bélica, né? Que eu acho que também é extremamente pertinente na maneira de como a ideia virótica constrói inimigos, né? Porque para construir, eu acho que é um pouco isso, né? Não é a metáfora que mata, mas para matar, primeiro você tem que tornar aquilo pensável, né? E eu acho que a ideia de transformar os outros em vírus, mas não só vírus, né? A gente usa uma série de ideias de doença para descrever problemas, o câncer da sociedade, uma série de outras coisas, né? E aqui eu só penso, tentando ir derivando um pouco, que eu acho que essa ideia entre metáforas viróticas, racismo e guerra, né? Que eu acho que é um pouco que talvez eu não vou saber responder a pergunta que também foi feita, sobretudo com relação ao país em contexto africano, com relação a, quer dizer, sempre passo soluções globais e cosmogonias ou cosmologias locais e práticas locais, mas me parece que eu acho que um dos supremos equívocos é justamente essa ideia do vírus como guerra, né? Como uma guerra contra o vírus, que eu acho que que talvez o nosso presidente um pouco sabe mobilizar isso de uma maneira muito bem feita, porque mobilizar as metáforas de guerra para combater a pandemia, eu acho que é justamente mobilizar toda uma linguagem que demanda, que pressupõe violências e sacrifício de uns, né? Pela pátria, pela economia, quer dizer, é uma guerra. Então, alguns têm que se sacrificar para que o país não pare. Alguns têm que se sacrificar para que a economia não possa parar, né? E eu acho e é isso, né? No final, quem mais sofre é a pobreza, e de quem mais se exige o sacrifício da ideia de guerra como forma de combate e pensar o combate à pandemia, eu acho que acaba justamente verdades não estão recebendo nada para ser cuidados. Do pouco que eu pude acompanhar ao longo da pandemia, inclusive por algumas, né, atividades que fizemos aqui na Unicamp, quer dizer, quando a gente olha para algumas favelas, comunidades periféricas e a maneira como eles estão tentando se autogerir, né? Porque a falta de recurso e a falta de atenção tem sido também, estão tentando se autogerir, é sempre por uma outra forma, né? A linguagem da autogestão, do autocuidado, quer dizer, é um outro idioma social que eu acho que ninguém se vê como uma guerra, mas é muito pelo contrário, né? É toda uma ideologia do cuidado, toda uma ideologia da atenção, uma ideologia da solidariedade. É um pouco, bastante nessas teclas que eu quis bater com relação aos idiomas, como se constroem as coisas, porque eu acho que é isso, é importante, né? É o importante para daí o que vai ser demandado das pessoas. E no caso dessas metáforas de guerra e vírus, eu acho que está muito entranhado na maneira de como a pandemia está sendo pensada. E, enfim, e justamente pensada em termos de uma guerra, desse sacrifício, que até agora pensando um pouco do que o Livio estava falando, dessas obsessões periféricas, um pouco que sempre se percebe né, essas nacionalidades periféricas como um povo em falta, que sempre pensa por ausência com relação a alguma coisa. Que é um pouco também nessa maneira, né? Quando, sei lá, se fala, não tem que ter tanto cuidado porque o brasileiro pula no esgoto e não acontece nada, né? É mais outras formas de atualização que me parece dessas, não só de uma visão de povo rebaixada, né? Mas todo ressonante de um imaginário racial que remete ali à ideia das imunidades ao sofrimento, à imunidade de corpos negros.
That reflects the immunity to the pain or to the disease. So the care for this population to to avoid the pain or the disease is not so important. So I think it's not only that, but it's not just the continuity, but what martial science speaks. Sometimes some things has to be transformed a lot to still be the same. I think that Livio has commented that in a country like Holland or Germany, there's a lot of optimism of the idea that we can come out of this pandemic much better. But I think this was a little bit of my provocation. But because I believe that our past has materialized other pandemic futures, this idea that this pandemic is going to make us better, I think that is a little bit a Christian thought that the sacrifice is worth. I think that's my first. Livio, Gustavo has spoken something. I want to remind us of two very emblematic things. One is the militarization of this character Zé Gotinha. And the Zé Gotinha with the clothing of the army is the symbol that fits perfectly in what you are saying. But I also believe, Gustavo, that's the inverse, but works the same way that you finish your talk. The white lady that did not want to be vaccinated by the black man. These images that we see, it's very difficult to not make confusion, agglomerations around the president. These images also bring the idea of this power of the body, of this superiority of the body, and reinforces the idea that the strong ones will survive, and they're going to expose everybody. And those who are good, who have good bodies, they will pass, they will survive. So is this other vine. One is the distancing, which is the purity, but the exposition, the idea of superiority and inferiority of bodies is also, so I think is very impressive that around the pandemic policies that is accentuated the huge gender difference that the Bolsonaro government has. There was always this idea that women are more wise than men, but in the case of Bolsonaro, this has to do with the measures that the images of body violence, exposition, street, being macho, being strong. This images also enters in the left, enters in the progressive. The machismo is a bonus. This when they talk about the mimimi, talking about the I'm saying that I wrote in a magazine, Argentina magazine, Social Democrat. I imagine that the progressive people from the more advanced thought, we have to understand what was wrong in our way of interpreting the world, because of course there is something was wrong. We're not trained to understand this exceptional climate environment. My train as a former activist of the left, maybe it was. And I was in that perspective that the world was always getting worse and never was improving. And there's a part of the Brazilian left that think like that. But my formation was very Anglo-Saxon, particularly in the Holland. But here we live in the exception state. But the social sciences are not taught for this state. You know, we understand that this pandemic is a macro crisis, but brings a great challenges to our formation. I don't feel capable to understand a great part of the things that are happening in the world. I don't know if you feel the same. Yes, every day that you hear some news, every time that you are watching the investigation committee questioning, all of that, we feel like we are not capable to build some sense of the impact that we are feeling, you know, the larger social impact that we're feeling nationally. I think it's a shared sensation, a shared feeling. And that's why I think it's important sometimes, although it's a pandemic that has unknown proportions, but it duplicate dilemmas. There are several exception regimes that were never different in the Brazilian society. It's very important. We cannot just think about the dimension of the rupture that a pandemic has provoked, but the persistences that, although it has maybe displaced, but it comes to reinforce. I think that my main provocation, or the thought that I want us to reflect, it was to emphasize the newness of what the pandemic brings to us in terms of effects, of problems, of inequalities, of what it forces to think, or forces how to think about the world, or to think. Some days ago, I was reading a text of Vernon talking about the bodies that had been, touched and disrespected. I think that the Brazilian society at this moment has learned in a very cruel way how to naturalize the death. But we have to think that about 500,000 people was not allowed the cry, the mourning. This 500,000 is going to cover its price, since this death could not be really mourned. These bodies, they are not in the world of the dead, and they are not in the world of the living. They are in this in-between. But we think where we are going when these 500,000 cadavers, bodies come to charge this price of not having had the right. We cannot think about this post-pandemic without thinking the post of the past, the post-abolition, the post-bubonic plague, the post. We are already the result of other post-epidemic future, but something came out wrong. Something came out wrong. So we have to look back at the past, in our past, to see what this other post came wrong. I don't know if it made sense, but it made all the sense, Gustavo. And this idea that you brought, the difficulty of not having the right ritual for each person that we lost. So the pain, the outraged bodies that we are just, the pain is always private. People are just kind of just thinking that that this doesn't happen in your family, that this should not happen. You have to think that this idea that connects us future and past, it reminded me Toni Morrison, in The Beloved, the baby that returned, that was the baby that was murdered, so it would not become a enslaved person, but the baby comes back to charge, for that life that was denied. So this remembrance that you bring to us, this remind that the exception state is a rule for a lot of us, and also in the sense to imagine a future is also to return to that part of the future that died with this outraged bodies of the past. And this will have to confront intellectually to imagine this period that we are thinking in the after, but it will bring a lot of the before. So I agree with you. Thank you, professors. The questions that are arriving are very in connection with what you are bringing. The first question, she says, of course, racial and cultural questions are important in the communication of the answer to COVID-19. So how Brazil contemplates its diversity to avoid dissemination and the COVID-19. Now, at this moment, Brazil, as government, is not taking advantage of this moment for anything. I have no doubt about. We talk a lot about the national, the federal executive, but I think that not a lot of things are not just the federal government. Although the president is the main responsible for the genocide that's going on, but in fact, and Matheus brought an important point, in no dimension there is a public mourning for this 500,000 people who are dying in no place. So this is a problem that is not just restricted to one dimension of the government. 500,000 people are dying and there is no governor, no mayor who is promoting some kind of public ritual to them. Is the idea of the outraged bodies. So I don't think Brazil is learning it. It's not learning anything. It's not using anything that could be of a learning. The little bit that I could follow, as I mentioned, many of the periphery of the cities and the communities and the favelas, they are giving excellent models of self-management. They are promoting the distribution of food, the manufacturing of masks. They are managing their own economy. They are promoting school rooms, assistance centers. People know how to self-manage, but this self-management comes from the absence of the lack of the government services in the area of health. I don't think, and would be enough only. The measure was with distribution of medications. Minimum things were not done, and much less to try to listen to the people, to see what they are learning, to support what they are doing, because they do it daily, you know, they take care of each other. Just to complement this point of Gustavo, in the case of São Paulo, one of the most important findings is how some regions where you had strong civilian mobilization, the pandemic did not have the reach that they wanted. So the political organization of the periphery is saving lives of the people. This was happening, but this context made it very clear how there are some social movement organizations are as important from the point of view of the demands, but also to support and maintain the life of those people. So for me, it's very clear now this other importance of the social movements. Now I think it's maybe Livio. Now, Livio. Professor Livio, you would like to say anything? I'm thinking. I'm really a little bit broken. There are questions that are for Matheus. There's a question in English that was if the Brazilian diversity. Did you see the question? Is in the chat. Is in the chat the question, Matheus. If the Brazilian diversity is reflected in the way we are fighting epidemics. I agree with Gustavo. No, the hierarchy is overlapped. When we see the order of the vaccination, I think the whites are benefited. So they have more longevity when you start the vaccination, 80 years old, 70 years old, 60 years old. You can see that all this first concentration of vaccine is in statistics, the neighborhood with older people in Brazil is the jardins, the gardens in São Paulo, and the municipality is Rio de Janeiro with less children. But the mortality has been much higher. There's almost a proportional direct relationship as if we compare the dead between São Paulo and Rio, is the case that São Paulo is the land of communists, or São Paulo, Bolsonaro had less influence. So in Rio, where the militias, owns the state, so everything is so terrible. So we have like Bahia, with half of the population of Rio, has the same amount of dead. And here we are in bad situation as well. So there is no creative advantage in this country for the preparation of this campaign, and there was not a national campaign. Zé Gotinha, which is this character that represents vaccination, and was a great hero of the past, and now he comes in dressed as military, as an army. So there was no national campaign about basic things. And this is symptomatic. That's the first time that the country confronts an epidemic or pandemic of this size without a national campaign. Although I agree with Gustavo, that's important to look at the past, to observe the past. I think this is the first pandemic that the state, the federal state, is confronting in the side of the pandemic, in favor of the pandemic and not against. This is an important point for reflection. It's the first pandemic that the president doesn't do these things that the Pope did. Even presidents of other countries that were very, 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 very rightist, they also took a vaccination took the vaccine as a propaganda. I don't want to disagree with Gustavo and Matheus. I think it's so important to make evident this continuity, but there are some differences that it silences, it leaves us with no words. We have a pandemic with an absent state or even against this idea of proposing the America Soccer Cup in Brazil. So countries like Colombia and Argentina, which has less incidence than Brazil, they refuse to host it. So there is something, I think the evil is perpetuated, but I think there are new phases of this evil. This is a conflict that I have. I'm very seduced, and this is one of the reasons you were invited, aside of your own qualification. But I think this history of the pandemics, the bubonic plague, etc., and in the Fábrica de Ideias, we have done that a lot, particularly in relationship to Africa. I think next class we are going to have a class that there is a native tradition in Africa to deal with the pandemic, like it was with the other pandemic. I think a colleague of us, Patricia, said that not only Latin America has the exception as the rule, as normality, but also in Africa. This would be an important point of comparison. I think that's one thing of many of my colleagues from several different African countries, from Senegal to Angola, is that they are tired of living in the constant state of exception. They kind of set up a conference and there's no water. So
Recording in
como dizia do
progress.
Boys. Né? Como se diz em português? Me ajude a traduzir, Gustavo.
Changing sense.
Change to continue the same. Yeah. What the same? Oh, same. Oh, I don't want to think that we're living the eternal repetition of what has been lived before. They transform themselves based in structures that informs these possibilities of futures. You talked about the vaccines. I think that now the vaccines themselves are coming in the code in the under the light of stratifications of the geopolitics, the vaccines of the rich countries, the vaccines of the poor countries, the vaccines that the rich people want. And I have a colleague that is working in Hungary. He was able to get vaccinated. They were able to get the vaccination fast because people did not want. Vaccination is becoming, indicator for stratification and social inequalities. This is part of the new world that we are living. I think I understand that. That's why it remind me of Salles, that the novelties are transformed to replace something. It's new, but replace. And sometimes it transforms to look like the same, although it's no longer the same. Is leopard in the leopardo. I changed everything, so I don't have to change anything. Diane, is there any new question? I think that Matheus, we had a question. We had one for him, and bring the one from Claudia. She is greeting everybody and congratulating everybody, and it would be important how the population has dealt with the conflicts about the need of the acting of the state and the insistence of the Brazilian government to deal with it. She wanted to hear from the lecturers the place of the prisons and of the people in situation of privation of freedom, and the idea that there are deaths that are not counted, not in numbers, not in history, as those lives don't matter at all. I think that we have talked a little bit about the absence of this government, and also how the people has to deal, and the question about the people imprisoned. Can we hear Matheus? I think he says he doesn't, he can. I think he is among students. Gustavo can answer. I'm going to start by the first question that talks about the acting or the absence of the state. This is not specifically a problem of the COVID, but is this model of management, particularly of territories and groups of classes that are in the most vulnerable situations, where we see a combination of the necropolitics to deal with these territories where we have ostensive presence. I think that a way of thinking the social situation
Recording in
demonstrado isso de
progress.
maneira muito forte, de como o racismo ela é uma produção de
In a
fronteira.
very clear and very strong way, racism is, I think, is responsible for the production of touching borders, how the bodies can or cannot be touched by the murders, but also another thing as the talking about the prisons, it looks like that the prisons, I think, replicates, the invisibility of these outraged bodies, of these deaths that are not even being counted. I think that the prison system should be one of the first places to receive the vaccination, but it's a extremely populated space of confinement because of the massive incarceration, and this was not even taught as a possibility. And besides that, of the little bit that I follow in this population, there are very problematic and wrong ways of managing the pandemic in the prison system, because basically the only more concrete measure was the prohibition of visiting, added to the process of COVID contamination that we have no idea. The associations of human rights are trying to get these numbers because we have no numbers for that. We may be creating a very problematic situation as taking as only measurement is the prohibition of visits, because the prison system, since the state does not supply, a number of things that people in prison needs, but the state doesn't give. And the only way to get it is through the visits, personal items of hygiene for women in situations of prison. So we create a political, sanitary, crisis that is multiplied by many. But I don't need to remind that some times ago, one of the measures that were taught for the prison system was something that were the containers for the isolation and deposit for the bodies. That was the only thing they thought about, nothing else. Diane, I heard that there was a question for me. I'm back and I can answer. So that's good. Giancarlos asks how the intellectual practice, the Afro-diasporic intellectual practice can build alternatives of sociability and social representation in the midst of this pandemic, in this Bolsonarian society that highlights racism as mode of virtue and courage. I think that's a very difficult question, but I think that we can look for, and this is what we're trying, other alternatives as intellectuals, as researchers, what we can do, and one of the ways we can contribute is try to see what kind of materials, what kind of sources, what kind of helps us to bring light to this in a different way. When I talk to Gustavo, let's work with literature. Let's work with that short story is to bring all the other kinds of sources that is unusual, but it makes possible to us to visualize a field of experience that is different. How we see, how we read the pandemic, visualizing the field of experiences that is in the present, how we can see visualize this pandemic by seeing the social experiences in the communities, like we mentioned before. So if we can see from different points of view, if different experiences can talk to us about, those experiences. So in these other places that several experiences allow us to understand how it I think that as you question, I think is the work of the Afro-diasporic intellectuals, but I think is the work of all intellectuals in the university to enlarge this field of visualization. I have to let people know that the first class of a mini course of Zamparoni was going to be June 8th, because June 3rd is a holiday. So the last webinar of this will be on June 17th, the same place. So any further information, you can look at the site. We have a last question from Patricia Romus, and this is to Luis Gustavo, but I think it can be answered by everyone. I think that's very important, these reflections of Luis Gustavo about the absence of a public mourning, public homage of the almost 500,000 bodies. So how can we continue without any kind of position of the public power? I wanted to leave for you to leave some positive message, optimistic message, for us, not to just well, I didn't want to sound there's not we are not seeing any mourning, any homage. I think there are many reactions in many sides, in many places. The manifestations, the last manifestations demonstrated that. And I think part of what we should deposit our strength, our hopes, is to claim, to demand the public recognition and public rituals to this death that allows us to project futures. We have to recognize this trauma. We have to recognize this trauma publicly. We have to ritualize that. How we do that, I don't know. But I think that we have to recognize the trauma and not to try to go along with this like it was done before in the dictatorship period, or during the post-abolition period. We have to recognize this trauma of the pandemic. So I don't want to use the word narrative that we use a lot now in the social sciences, but We have this trauma is going to be a dispute arena to build a post-COVID future. And we are going to have to resist there. So the feeling of 500,000 deaths would not be forgot, would not be not considered. I don't want to think this as a defeat, but I want to show that we have to being able to reconstruct ourselves as country. We have to take that in consideration to build a better post-pandemic future. Otherwise, we're going to be included in this way of think of accommodation, of pact. I think that we have to bring the trauma. I want to insist that. Otherwise, we are risking to enter another discourse that is very strong in the Brazilian society, that is to minimize the violence that supports, that is one of the bases for this country. When I repeat that, I don't want to pass an idea of despair or defeat, but what I want to say is that we have to recognize the trauma. We don't want it to become a new roses of the Brazilian culture. This trauma has to be brought and has to be faced. I'm going to continue agreeing with Gustavo. I believe that in this situation that we are thinking about the possible futures that we are trying to imagine, it has to include the denaturalization of the violence, the denaturalization of the murders and the death. So when we look at the mobilizations in the peripheries, the young black youth that was engaged about in the campaign of the genocide against the genocide of the black population, they start to create fronts in favor of the life, fronts for the vaccine, favor is not a message of despair, but any hope possible only can happen with the denaturalization of the death by this COVID. And these new movements against the genocide of the black youth. I think this should be looked as part of the effort of the denaturalization of the genocide in Brazil. And they use these very poor terms that is like identity movements, like if people are just looking for their own benefit. But when we can see it as movements that are fighting for the denaturalization of the violence, we can see as much bigger. We are already a product of other future, post-epidemic futures. But in a more democratic way, we cannot face this future without the denaturalization of the violence. Is the one way that we are able to sit down and see this number of deaths is because we spend a lot of time sitting down and watching the number of black youth murdered, the number of the violence in the of the police. So this previous violence has prepared us to deal in a very usual ways with this pandemic. We have to take this trauma in consideration because this trauma brings includes many others that we have not dealt with before. I would just like to add two things. This pandemic, of course, Brazil was not prepared for it for two reasons. Brazil is a country where the violence and the homicide, the violence by the homicide and the violence by the transit, by car accidents, we are used to the death. We are used to the bodies. We are a country that never was able to deal with its past. We had no truth commission. We forgive or we forget what happens in the dictatorship. We are an exception in Latin America. We are not just the exception because we speak Portuguese, but other countries had dictatorships, dictatorships that were even more terrible, but they confronted, and they had, we're not used to confront, to count our death, to see who are responsible, which our elites, it was to make us to think that some deaths are not worth it to be counted for, and some are. So we never had a commission for the reconciliation and for the truth. We are a segregated country. We are a divided country. We are a hyper-violent country. When we talk about Brazilian exceptionality, it's not Brazil is only the country of the horrors, but it's the country of the resilience and many positive things that we cannot forget. But we came to this pandemic with this enemy government, absent government, and little experience to rendering, our responsibilities with the past. I hope this time we can learn and improve. A great embrace to all of you. Thank you. So I pass the floor to Diane. Thank you, everybody who participated, all the lecturers. The question about the prisons was done by Amanda Oliveira, and I quote another person. If you want to do a final greeting or final consideration, very briefly, I want to reinforce and thank immensely the invitation. When Matheus mentioned in the beginning, I always, since I was a graduation student, I wanted to be part of Fábrica de Ideias. I had no chance. One time I sent, but I was not accepted. But I'm very happy that this time I can be participating. I think it's an honor. Fábrica de Ideias is a priceless what it has been done in terms of critical reflection. So this factory of ideas, it repositions the importance of thinking Brazil in this international dialogue and within Brazil as well. And I hope that the conversation made some sense and that we don't just live here with the idea of despair or defeat. is in the opposite, is to emphasize the opportunities of the present, learning from our past, to understand a little bit the many knots where the naturalized violence has impeded the futures in the most democratic way, and not just overcome COVID, but to overcome something new that we can call a democracy can be called, as the Black Coalition for Human Rights. If we take the racism from the base of the countries will come down, as Mano Brown says, but we have to think about that. I just want to thank, I'm just with this very, very happy idea that I finally got to this Fábrica de Ideias. So when you finish your doctorate, your PhD, so I cannot go to Fábrica de Ideias anymore. So Livio has solved this in a very nice way, inviting us to share what we learn when we observe this context from other experiences, We talked about the communities of Rio, about São Luís. What other contexts we can bring? This was a little bit of our provocation. I hope it makes sense. It was great to participate. Thank you, Livio, for the invitation. You want to close, Professor Livio? He just, I'm just send embraces to everybody. I hope that Gustavo and Matheus, that we continue this contact and maybe we can do more things together. Thank you, everybody. See you next day. So we close here. Thank you all very much.